Arleen Tuchman is a specialist in the history of medicine in the United States and Europe, with research interests in the cultural history of health, disease, and addiction, the rise of scientific medicine, and scientific and medical constructions of gender and sexuality. She is the author of 3 books, the most recent being Diabetes, A History of Race and Disease, published by Yale University Press in 2020, which has won the 2021 Prose Book Award in History of Science, Medicine, and Technology from the Association of American Publishers, and the 2022 George Rosen Prize in the History of Public Health, Social Medicine from the American Association for the History of Medicine. She's currently working on a history of addiction and the family in the United States. Tuchman is a past director of Vanderbilt University Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, and has, since 2019, been the co-creator of a historic medicinal garden on Vanderbilt University's campus. She is, of course, many things beyond this, but please help me welcome great Arleen Tuchman to the podium. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I can't really see your faces except for the front row, but I'm really delighted to be here. I want to begin by thanking Professor Anouar Majid for inviting me to speak today, and Lucille Smith for making the arrangements and putting me up at the wonderful Press Hotel. I'm really very happy there. I also want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book on the history of diabetes and race, which came out in 2020, about 6 months after the pandemic hit. And so I haven't given too many talks in person. Most of my talks have been on Zoom, and I'm really glad that you don't all look like Hollywood squares. So I thought I'd begin by sharing how I got interested in this topic. I was finishing my last book, and I was thinking about what I might do next, and I'd long been interested in the history of disease, and so I was thinking about that as a topic. My previous books were not on the history of a disease. And at that time, my dad decided to move to Nashville. This was 2002. So he'd been diagnosed with diabetes in 1985 when he was 65 years old, and his doctor just assumed that he had type 2. Excuse me. Now, this made sense. My dad was short. On a good day, he might reach 5 feet 4 inches. He weighed 150 pounds, and this made him, put him in the overweight category, and that was considered a risk factor. He was also in his mid-60s, which was another risk factor. But it turns out that his physician, who was an internist, was wrong. And it wasn't until my parents moved to Florida, they were living in New York at the time, it wasn't until they moved to Florida a year and a half later that an endocrinologist realized that my dad had latent autoimmune diabetes of adults, or LADA, which is a slow progressing form of autoimmune diabetes, where the pancreas eventually stops producing insulin. By that time, by the time he got the correct diagnosis, his weight had dropped from the 150 pounds down to 115. So he'd lost about 20% of his body weight. The moment my dad received the new diagnosis, he began injecting insulin 4 times a day, which is what he did until he passed away in 2013. He never was able to adapt to any of the new technologies. He passed away in 2013, 1 month shy of his 93rd birthday, and I want to add, 2 weeks after his only grandchild, my son, was bar mitzvahed. And I am confident that my dad willed himself to survive long enough to participate in that event. Well, my dad's misdiagnosis intrigued me, as did being around my dad and learning more about the baffling nature of this disease. So I started reading what was available about the history of diabetes. And I learned quickly that most of the works were about type 1 diabetes, what I grew up calling juvenile onset diabetes. It is believed today to be an autoimmune disease, but basically what we know is that the pancreas doesn't produce any insulin at all. So I began wondering, since most of the works were on type 1, what would it be like to write a book about type 2, what I grew up calling adult onset diabetes? So it took me a few years to realize that even phrasing this in that way or framing it in that way was anachronistic, because the different types of diabetes were not formally distinguished until the 1970s. Now, they recognized that it mattered before it was distinguished. If we go back to like the early 20th century, they recognized that it mattered when the disease manifested. That is, if a child developed diabetes, they knew that the prognosis was far worse. But they still believed that both types had the same basic underlying pathophysiology. So at that point, I realized that I was really writing a history of diabetes, not one of the types. Okay, so I thought, this might be an interesting book to write. But what really grabbed me and made me to decide to write this book was learning that about 100 years ago, diabetes was considered a Jewish disease. And that was so different than what I was reading in the news about the populations that were believed to be most at risk of developing diabetes, right? I was reading that Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinx populations were the most likely to develop the disease. So I was hooked, right? How, I wondered, did diabetes go from being a Jewish disease to a disease of Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinx populations? So the central argument of my book, and the main point that I'm going to make today, is that there is a long history of using race and class to explain health disparities in diabetes. And race in my work is not code for Black. Rather, it refers to a number of different racialized populations which at some point in the past were labeled most likely to develop diabetes. And you can see this from my table of contents. I organized my book somewhat chronologically, well, mostly chronologically, around the populations believed to have the highest rates of diabetes at different points in time. So the first chapter is on Jews. In Europe, they actually refer to diabetes as the UNE Center, a Jewish disease. The second chapter is on white people in general. The third chapter is about the invisibility of diabetes in African American communities in the first half of the 20th century. The fourth chapter is about Native Americans, and the fifth is about the discovery of diabetes in several different racialized populations in the 1980s, and basically the same groups that we read about today and that were identified in the mid-1980s. So as I show, the focus on race meant that the dominant approach to explaining health disparities has been to look to and to blame the biology and the behaviors of those who were sick for the high rates, which has made it difficult to give more attention to structural inequalities, to structural racism, and in general to social determinants of health. That is, to really grapple with the role of racism and poverty in making people sick, and thus in producing differential disease rates. And I want to mention that the World Medical Organization just met in October in Berlin, Germany, and they have declared racism to be a public health threat. So there is a rich body of scholarship examining racial health disparities in diabetes today. And these include trenchant critiques of the inequities that exist in our current healthcare system, which we have seen very clearly in the recent pandemic. What I have to contribute to this work is a historical perspective, because many of the problems that we are confronting today have their roots in the past. Now, this claim would not be a surprise to anyone familiar with the history of medicine. There are many excellent studies of the central role of race and racism in the history of disease. My book is heavily indebted to these studies. What's unusual about the story that I tell, however, is that diabetes went through not one, but multiple racial transformations over the more than 100-year period that I cover in my story, in my book. So it brings into even sharper relief the persistent presence of race and class to some extent in writings on disease, even as the racialized group considered most vulnerable changed with time, and even as definitions of race and diabetes proved highly unstable. Okay, so before I dive into the body of my paper, there's one thing I want to clarify, and that is I cannot tell you whether diabetes rates for different racialized groups really changed over time. All right, I can't tell you whether Jews in the early 20th century really suffered more from the disease than other populations. And the reason is simply that the statistics are not reliable. What's important is that this was recognized at the time. That is, in the early 20th century, people in the medical and public health communities said that the statistics were not always reliable. So what my book shows is that racist assumptions became part of the explanation for why certain populations had higher rates of the disease than others, despite acknowledgement that the statistics were problematic. So really, what I have written is a cultural history of diabetes. So where have racism and class prejudice shown up in diabetes past? And to answer this question today, I have chosen 3 case studies from different chapters of my book. So let's begin by going back to the early 20th century, when the group believed to be most at risk of developing diabetes consisted of white people in general and Jews in particular, and Jews were thought of as a separate race. Diabetes was also believed to be a disease of the middle and upper classes. And it was believed that the rates were lowest among Native Americans and African Americans. This is what physicians and public health officials saw when they looked at the data. I want to provide just a few examples of the claims that people made at the time. So here is William Osler, a highly regarded clinician. He's the author of a book titled The Principles and Practice of Medicine, which was the standard text of clinical medicine at the time. In the 1892 edition of this book, and in subsequent editions, he wrote, "Hebrews seem especially prone to diabetes." Elliot Joslin, perhaps the best-known diabetes specialist in the country, commented in 1916 that the frequency with which diabetes occurs in the Jewish race is proverbial. Even Jewish physicians agreed that rates were high in their population. In the early 20th century, the physician Maurice Fishberg co-authored an article with an historian, Joseph Jacobs, and this article was on diabetes, and they wrote it for a multi-volume work called the Jewish Encyclopedia. This encyclopedia was intended to counter anti-Semitism by sharing knowledge about Jews, right? To counter prejudice with information. The encyclopedia talked about the holidays, traditional foods, religious observances, cultural practices, and diseases. And what they wrote was statistics prove conclusively that the disease occurs among Jews from 2 to 6 times as frequently as it does among non-Jews. So this was a widespread belief. Hardly anyone questioned it at the time. But how did they explain it? Well, we cannot understand early 20th century claims without acknowledging the widespread acceptance of scientific racism. This is very simply the belief that different races existed, that they differed biologically, and that they could be ranked from least evolved to most evolved. So scientific racism was not born in the late 19th century, but it really took root then. This is the time when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, and then in 1871 he published The Descent of Man, where he insisted that the races existed in a hierarchy going from the most primitive tribes of humankind to the most civilized. It's the decades of social Darwinism, which posited a struggle for existence between the different races of humankind. It's the decades when eugenics really took root. The term was coined by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who sought to improve humankind by preventing the unfit from reproducing while encouraging those with better genes to have more children. Now, these assertions were believed to be grounded in scientific evidence. One common way to prove this belief in a hierarchy was to measure skulls, and some of you may have heard of craniometry, and invariably, white people were shown to have the largest skulls and black people the smallest. And the size of the skull mattered because it was believed to be an indication of the size of the brain, the quality of the mind. And since the brain was part of the nervous system, it's not surprising that another important marker of a race's place on the evolutionary ladder was the development of the nervous system. Finally, and this might be the most surprising, disease was also a marker. Primitive peoples were believed to suffer more from dirty, infectious diseases. Civilized peoples, in contrast, were believed to have advanced to chronic diseases in general, but most importantly to diseases of the nervous system, and diabetes was believed to have an intimate connection to the nervous system. So having diabetes marked one as being a civilized people. Well, let me point out that the turn of the century is exactly the time when mortality rates from chronic diseases began to surpass those from infectious diseases for white people. Not surprisingly, these are also the decades when diabetes first began to be viewed as a major health problem, and physicians and public health officials raised concerns about the rapid rise of morbidity and mortality rates from diabetes. And one of their questions was how to explain the racial disparities in diabetes rates. Their answers drew directly on scientific racism. Why did diabetes afflict white people in general, and especially Jews, more than black people and Native Americans? They argued that it was because their nervous system was more advanced. That's what made them more intelligent, right? The advanced nervous system. It's what made them more civilized, and it's what made them more susceptible to diseases of the nervous system. Accordingly, rates were believed to be the lowest among black and Native peoples because their nervous system was dull, undeveloped, and insensitive. So don't just take my word for it. Here is Emil Klein, a Swedish physician whose translated work on diabetes circulated widely in the United States in 1900. Among all people beyond the pale of culture, diabetes is very rare. This I believe to be the correct way of viewing immunity among Africans, and the reason why so little is heard of diabetes among the Indians of America. With greater intellectual exertion, keener emotions, higher nervous development, more earnest struggle of existence, right? This is right out of Darwin. More urgent demands, a more intense culture. In fine, we are bound to find more diabetes mellitus. Here is Ivan Lehman, a physician who practiced in New Orleans and who conducted medical research on diabetes patients. Here's what he said in 1920. Nervous strain, intense application to business, mental shock and worry have frequently seemed to play an important role in precipitating the phenomena of the disease or aggravating it. The Negro race is to a very great degree free from these influences. The mental and nervous makeup of the Negro is in marked contrast to that of the Jews, among whom diabetes is disproportionately frequent. So diabetes was a marker of civilization. It was also tied to wealth, which was itself believed to be a marker of civilization. According to William Osler, it was a disease of the higher classes. Right? It's so different than today. This ability to read diabetes in a positive light, if you'll allow me that expression, it didn't prevent some physicians from using high rates of the disease among Jews to support their anti-Semitism. One physician who worked for the United States Public Health Service labeled Jews a highly inbred and psychopathically inclined race. And he blamed high rates of diabetes on some hereditary defect, which they exacerbated by the practice of inbreeding. Another attributed it to their neurotic temperament, and yet a third blamed it on their racial tendency to corpulence. But what's important is that there was a spectrum of meanings to draw from. Jewish physicians accepted diabetes was prevalent in their communities and accepted it had something to do with biology and with their race. But they rejected the idea that it was a hereditary defect. Instead, they blamed the high rates on millennia of anti-Semitism. They argued it was the anti-Semitism that had rendered their nervous system labile. Here is Albert Epstein, a nephrologist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And this is from a speech he gave to the National Conference of Jewish Charities in 1919. The conditions under which the Jews have lived for many centuries have been such as would shatter the most resistant nervous system. We know what baneful influences suffering and misfortune can exercise on the mental and physical being of man. The recent war, right, World War I, affords many sad examples of that. How much more profound must that influence be on a people who for many generations, year in and year out, from the cradle to the grave, have endured oppression, privation, and every possible mental distress. Jewish physicians were convinced that when anti-Semitism was eradicated, diabetes rates would also decline. But they also had the extra bonus of reading the high rates as a sign of their advanced state of civilization. In the words of the authors of the article on diabetes that I already cited that appeared in the Jewish Encyclopedia, they said, with the present knowledge of the pathogenesis of diabetes, the only reasonable explanation of the frequency of the disease among Jews is their extreme nervousness, the Jews being known as the most nervous of civilized peoples. So What are the consequences of reading diabetes through a racial lens in the early 20th century? The first, I don't remember if I have a slide on this. No. The first is that only Jewish physicians took seriously the claim that anti-Semitism created conditions that drove up diabetes rates. Most others blamed it either on a hereditary defect or a love of good living, right? So either on biology or behaviors. Another consequence is that diabetes was rendered invisible in other communities. This is important because evidence began to emerge in the 1930s that rates of diabetes were rising in Black communities. The data came from urban clinics in the North and the South that saw large numbers of Black patients. And the data also came from statistics from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. But few paid attention. There are several reasons for this, but what most interests me is that the cultural script was too strong that linked diabetes with people who were white, with Jews, and with wealth. And one example to drive it home comes from a discussion following a paper that was given at a medical conference. The presenter at the conference had shared data that he interpreted as showing that there were few differences any longer in diabetes rates between white and Black patients. But a physician in the audience found this hard to believe. The physician, Mary Freeman from Florida, responded in this way: "I should like to ask the author of the paper whether there was a great deal of admixture of white blood in the darkies in whom he noticed diabetes. As far as my observation goes, Black Negroes stand shock and accident better than the lighter ones. I have not as yet seen a Black Negro who showed any high degree of nervousness, no matter what ailed him. But the more white blood they have, the more nervous they become." Others had similar reactions, which brings home that diabetes was not seen in Black patients, or at the very least, it was explained away. The relative invisibility of diabetes in the African American community did not really change until the 1980s, but by that time, another racialized group had earned the label most at risk, and that was Native Americans. So I'm going to move to my second case study. I'm going to bring you up to the 1960s and to Native American reservations, which for a number of reasons had become sites of federally funded medical studies. These studies revealed that several tribes had some of the highest rates, not only in the United States, but in the world. But no one in the 1960s viewed diabetes any longer as a marker of civilization. On the contrary, the popular explanation, captured in the thrifty gene hypothesis, which I will get to in a second, was that diabetes rates increased dramatically when so-called primitive bodies were catapulted into the 20th century. The thrifty gene hypothesis was the brainchild of the physician and human geneticist James Neal. Neal began with the following question: why is diabetes mellitus spreading throughout the globe? Why hadn't natural selection wiped it out? Now, Neal had done work on sickle cell anemia. He knew about the link between sickle cell and malaria, and he wondered, could I come up with a similar evolutionary story that could explain the selective advantage that might have kept a diabetic genotype in the gene pool? He published this in 1962. I'm not going to read that to you, don't worry. And in his now very famous article, anytime anyone comes across or mentions the thrifty gene hypothesis, this is the article that they mention. Neil asked his readers to imagine early humans living through alternating periods of feast and famine. Those who could store fat efficiently, he reasoned, would have had a competitive advantage because they could store food during times of feast, which would allow them to survive periods of famine. And survival for an evolutionist means you get to reproduce. And that's what could have kept a thrifty gene in the gene pool. The problem arose, he explained, when people had food all the time, because then being an efficient fat store would become a liability. Neil, in this article, said nothing about native peoples. In fact, he didn't mention them at all in this article. Instead, he was trying to understand the near universal distribution of diabetes. He was thinking about all the peoples in the world. He also never presented this as a fact. He always viewed it as a hypothesis. But others narrowed it to indigenous populations locating a diabetes genotype in native bodies. The thrifty gene hypothesis, as it developed, was based on the assumption that native peoples were frozen in time genetically, still possessing the same genotype that had been common among early humans. And this is also what James Neal believed. In 1968, he opened a conference on Native Americans and health by claiming that Native Americans provided one of the last great resources for the study of primitive man, one of the last opportunities to attempt to fathom the nature of the forces to which man was responding during the course of human evolution. So the explanation that emerged was that Native Americans were experiencing high rates of diabetes mellitus because their primitive bodies had been parachuted into the 20th century in the space of a few years and didn't have the time to adapt. And I just want to say again that in this formulation, diabetes was no longer a marker of civilization, but of primitive bodies. The disease had not changed. It was the cultural script that was flipped on its head. Now, once again, this was not the only explanation. Native activists, like Jewish physicians, argued that high rates of diabetes stemmed from racism. In their case, from white settler colonialism and the demise of traditional foodways. In the 1970s and the 1980s, they issued withering critiques of the actions of so-called civilized whites. They argued diabetes had not been a problem for them until white settlers stole native lands and created the conditions for mass starvation. The Akimel Udam, who are also known as Pima, who live in Arizona and have either the highest or the second highest rate of diabetes in the world, they trace this problem to the early 20th century when white people dammed and diverted the flow of the Gila River away from their reservation and to their own white communities. Before then, the Akimel Udam had used the river to irrigate their lands and to farm. But because of the dam, they experienced mass starvation, which made them dependent upon government rations. The rations consisted of flour, lard, coffee, sugar, salt, tobacco, and salt pork. Nothing like the squash and beans that they had grown. By the 1960s, the trading posts had added calorie-dense junk food and soda. So from their perspective, the main reasons for high rates were not thrifty genes or poor lifestyle. And in fact, they weren't denying that there was a biological component, But the main reason for them, and I'm quoting here, were new diets, economic disaster, and social stress. So let me point out that in both the case with Jews and with Native Americans, there were competing ways of explaining high rates. The dominant explanation focused on the bodies and the behaviors of those who were sick, and they trafficked in racial and racist stereotypes. The other way of explaining high rates was to focus on prejudice and discrimination, but this way had difficulty gaining traction. The 1970s was a time of some optimism. It seemed possible in that decade that social determinants of health might gain more attention. In addition to what the nation was learning about Native populations, there was also a growing awareness of high rates among Black people living both in the South and in the North. This increased information was the result of the civil rights movement, of the war on poverty, and later the Black Power and Indian rights movements. All of them drew attention to social determinants of health, and they insisted that racial discrimination and poverty were making people sick. This was the heyday of community health centers designed to empower people to understand the roots of their problems and to take charge of their lives and their health. But this momentum was crushed when Reagan came to power and brought with him an emphasis on small government and individual responsibility, which meant that funding dried up and the narrative changed. So for my third case study, this time I chose not a single population, but rather a case study about how diabetes prevalence was imagined and seen in the 1980s. It's the story of the Heckler report, which was a government-commissioned study of health disparities that came out in 1985. It was the brainchild of Margaret Heckler, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, a Reagan appointee, and Thomas Malone, the Deputy Director of the National Institutes of Health. And this study came about because Heckler and Malone had noticed that while the health of Americans was improving overall, not every population was enjoying that improvement equally. And they wanted to know how bad were the disparities. So they established a task force on Black and minority health, and their task was to gather information. So they didn't conduct their own research. What they did was a literature review. They chose the 6 health conditions that had the greatest disparities. Diabetes was one of them. And they decided to focus on 4 racial groups: Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Asian and Pacific Islanders, and they were all compared to whites. The Heckler report ran to 10 volumes, and it sent shockwaves through the nation. No one could believe that the disparities were that bad. One outcome was the establishment of the Office of Minority Health in 1986, so really quickly. The goal of this office, of this new office, was to improve the health of racial and ethnic minority populations by eliminating health disparities. That was 1986. So that has obviously not happened. And I would argue that in part, it's in part because the study was flawed. And one of the major flaws was that the emphasis throughout the study was placed on the bodies and the behaviors of those who were sick. Social determinants of health were basically invisible in this study. This was the message that Heckler also took with her when she traveled around the country to share her findings. For example, when speaking to the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women's Clubs, she said, "Changes in lifestyle never come easy. But come they must if many Black Americans are to live longer and healthier lives. Some of these changes are personal and cannot be made by a government in a free society. They must be voluntary, but they must be made. Now, once again, such pronouncements were challenged. Like Jewish physicians and Native American activists, Dr. Edith Irby Jones, the president of the National Medical Association, and I should point out that association was founded in 1895 because the AMA, the American Medical Association, at that time did not allow any person who wasn't white to be a member of their group. So Jones chastised Heckler for implying that Black people simply needed to behave in order to solve their health problems. In her words, blaming the patient will not cure the ills of America's underserved minorities. The diseases correctly identified by HHS as affecting the health of the Black community so devastatingly are in large measure the result of poverty, neglect, underlying prejudices, and the resulting stress. We all know that while health education indeed may be helpful, as Mrs. Heckler suggests, what we really need is better nutrition in early life, better housing, and more and better jobs. Another consequence of the focus on the bodies and behaviors of particular racial groups is that it rendered high rates of diabetes invisible among poor whites. It took another 15 years or more for attention to be directed, for example, to high rates of diabetes in Appalachia. So what the Heckler report did was to draw needed attention to health disparities, but it also erased structural racism and other social determinants of health. Now, to be fair to the task force, the report mentioned a link between poverty and health disparities in the first volume, the first of the 10. And that's the volume where they provided an overall summary of the committee's findings. They mentioned the impact on health of nutrition and diet, of exposure to environmental hazards at home and at work, and patterns of coping with stress. They also mentioned much higher levels of unemployment and poverty among minority families as compared to white families. So they were aware. This wasn't a question of not knowing. Yet few of these insights made their way into the heart of the report. That is, the subsequent 9 volumes where the task force explored the 6 health conditions in detail. Instead, they kept the focus on each group's behaviors and lifestyle choices. So, can someone tell me what time it is? Okay, all right. So I have a longer version and a shorter version, and I'm going to go to the shorter version in the interest of Q&A. It's not over yet, but I cut out a little bit of time. Okay, so as a way of wrapping up, let me reiterate that the dominant paradigm or frame for explaining health disparities and diabetes rates has long been race, both genetic and behavioral. And that preference is not because of the data. History shows that data can be interpreted through different lenses. Instead of race, the focus could have been on racism. Instead of emphasizing poor lifestyle choices and behavior, social determinants of health could have been prioritized, since they strongly affect the choices people are able to make. And as I've shown, there have always been individuals and groups who have tried to shift the focus in this way, but they had difficulty gaining traction. So my final story today is about how this history of race and diabetes bears on how we think about the differences today between type 1 and type 2. In fact, I conclude my book by arguing that the image of diabetes as a disease of civilization has not so much disappeared as it has become channeled into some of the characterizations we make of people with type 1. Among the most compelling images for type 1 diabetes are those of children who have to learn how to give themselves injections. They seem responsible, mature beyond their years, almost always white, and they tug at our heartstrings. In contrast, people with type 2 diabetes are thought of as indulgent, lazy, and fat. They're also often imagined as either a person of color or as white and poor. They're cast as individuals who, in contrast to people with type 1, could control their diabetes if they chose to. So I'm going to close by reading from the conclusion of my book. You can read along with me. A language of choice and control implies that all that someone needs to do to become healthy is to decide to eat well, exercise frequently, visit a doctor regularly, and take prescribed medicines. Nowhere in this formulation is there any acknowledgement of the uneven distribution of resources that can make it difficult for even a well-intentioned individual to make what are considered healthy choices. Nor is there any recognition that racism and poverty are themselves fundamental causes of ill health, potentially exacerbating diabetes by raising stress and glucose levels, and certainly placing an additional burden on individuals who may already be struggling to make ends meet. Casting those with type 2 diabetes as responsible for their disease masks the structural inequalities that produce poor health and divides people with diabetes into those who are innocent and those who are guilty. It's not surprising that the mother of a young girl with type 1 diabetes expressed her wish that it had a different name. Thank you.